Welcome to Life Story 999, where we share captivating tales of resilience, hope, and the power of family. Today, we invite you to meet Clara Johnson, an inspiring woman whose life has been a testament to strength and perseverance. Clara is a kind-hearted lady in her late 70s, and she has lived in her modest home for over 50 years. Nestled in a small, close-knit neighborhood, her house is surrounded by memories, friendships, and the passage of time. Clara has witnessed the community evolve as new families moved in and old friends moved away, yet she remains steadfast, a pillar of familiarity amidst the shifting landscape. Clara's life has been marked by resilience, forged during a time when challenges were constant and the fight for equality was intense. Born in the 1940s, she grew up in the segregated South and lived through the civil rights era, an experience that shaped her into the strong woman she is today. She has seen the very best and worst of humanity. Her memories are filled with both hardship and hope. The faces of those who fought for change, the long marches, and the echoes of powerful speeches that called for justice. Clara was never one to sit idly by. She stood shoulder to shoulder with her community, participating in marches and meetings, doing what she could to make a difference. These experiences instilled in Clara a deep belief in justice and equality, values that she passed on to her only son, Daniel Johnson. Daniel grew up hearing his mother's stories of perseverance and courage. Inspired by her strength, he was determined to make something of himself and contribute to the world in a meaningful way. Against the odds, Daniel went on to become one of the most respected judges in the state of Georgia. Known for his fair and just approach, Daniel is admired for his commitment to seeing beyond prejudice, treating every individual who comes into his courtroom with the respect they deserve. Despite his success, Daniel has never forgotten his roots or the sacrifices his mother made for him. He knows that his achievements are built upon Clara's hard work, love, and unyielding determination. Every week, without fail, Daniel visits Clara. Sundays have become a cherished ritual for both of them. Daniel arrives with groceries and a bright smile, and they sit together for hours, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes even tears. Clara keeps his old room exactly as it was when he left for college, a tribute to the dreams she nurtured for him, dreams that have come true. The neighborhood around Clara has changed a lot over the years. What was once a predominantly black community has slowly gentrified, with new families moving in and property values rising. Despite the changes, Clara remains a cornerstone of the neighborhood. She greets every new face with a warm smile and continues to nurture the small garden in her front yard, offering fresh vegetables to anyone in need. Clara Johnson's story is one of quiet strength and unwavering love, a story that reminds us of the power of family and the importance of standing by what is right, even as the world changes around us. One peaceful afternoon, Clara Johnson sat on her porch, rocking gently in her favorite chair and enjoying the warm Georgia breeze. Her garden, vibrant with colorful flowers and the lush green of her vegetable patch, provided a calming backdrop. Clara treasured these moments, watching the world around her and feeling a sense of quiet contentment. But on this particular day, her peace was shattered. Clara noticed her neighbor, Mrs. Summers, glancing her way, a frown creasing her face. Mrs. Summers, who had moved into the neighborhood a few years ago, had always been a little distant. Today, her gaze lingered on Clara, and Clara could feel the suspicion in her eyes. She tried to offer a smile, but Mrs. Summers quickly looked away, hurrying into her house. Clara shook her head slightly, brushing off the discomfort and focusing again on the hummingbirds visiting her feeder. Moments later, the sudden wail of police sirens broke the tranquility. Clara's heart skipped a beat as two police cruisers sped down her quiet street, coming to a screeching halt right in front of her house. The officers quickly exited their vehicles. Two men, both of them white, wearing tense expressions. Clara's stomach sank as they approached her porch with determination. She could see their hands hovering near their belts, ready to reach for something if needed. Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, unsure of what was happening. "Ma'am, We've received a report of suspicious activity in the area. The lead officer, a burly man with a stern face, called out as he approached. Clara looked at him, bewildered. Suspicious activity? Here, in her own home? She kept her composure, leaning forward slightly as she spoke, her voice calm but confused. I'm sorry, officers, but I think there must be some mistake. I've just been sitting here on my porch, enjoying the afternoon. The second officer, a younger man with a more hesitant demeanor, spoke up. Ma'am, we were told someone was wandering around the neighborhood, looking into windows, and you matched the description. He glanced at Mrs. Summers' house, where Clara could see a curtain twitch. Realization dawned. Mrs. Summers must have called the police. Clara's face tightened, but she remained polite. I assure you, I've been right here since lunchtime. I haven't moved from this spot. The lead officer wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, his expression hardening. Do you have any identification on you, ma'am? We need to verify that you belong here. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The indignity of it all stung deeply. Having to prove that she belonged on her own front porch in the house she'd lived in for over 50 years. She straightened her back, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. I'm Clara Johnson. I've lived in this house for decades. I don't carry identification to sit on my own porch. The officers exchanged glances, and the lead officer's demeanor grew more confrontational. Ma'am, we need your cooperation. If you can't provide proof of residence, we may have to take you down to the station for further questioning. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of situations like this, incidents that escalated for no good reason, where innocent people were treated like criminals. She had never imagined she would be in such a position herself, especially not at her age, sitting on her porch. Officers, I've done nothing wrong, Clara insisted, her voice unwavering despite the fear creeping in. This is my home, and I have every right to be here. If you need proof, you can check the property records or ask anyone in the neighborhood. She gestured vaguely towards the other houses, hoping that perhaps one of her longtime neighbors might come out to support her. But the street remained quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. The lead officer's patience seemed to be wearing thin. He stepped even closer, his tone more forceful. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, ma'am. Just admit you were looking around where you shouldn't have been, and we can get this sorted out quickly. Clara felt a surge of indignation. She had faced much worse in her lifetime. She had stood her ground during the civil rights marches, faced down hostility, and fought for her right to be treated with dignity. She wasn't about to back down now. I will not admit to something I haven't done, Clara said firmly, her eyes locking onto the officers. I am a law-abiding citizen, and I will not be bullied. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, as if sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control. He glanced towards his partner, but the lead officer seemed intent on pressing forward. All right, ma'am, stand up slowly and put your hands behind your back. You're coming with us, the lead officer ordered. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her eyes widening in shock. She had hoped they would see reason, that they would understand she was no threat. As the officers moved to take her, Clara thought of her son, Daniel. Of all the lessons she had taught him about standing up for what was right, about never letting fear dictate his actions. Now, she would have to live by those same lessons. I'm not going anywhere, she declared, her voice ringing out across the quiet street. This is my home, and I have done nothing wrong. The officers hesitated for a moment, taken aback by the strength in her voice. But before they could act further, a new voice cut through the tension, strong, commanding, and filled with authority. What is going on here? All heads turned to see a tall, well-dressed black man striding towards them, his expression a mix of concern and barely restrained anger. Clara's heart swelled with relief. It was Daniel. Her son had arrived just in time. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. He was not just any concerned family member. He was a respected judge, and he was not about to let his mother be treated unjustly. Daniel reached the porch, positioning himself between Clara and the officers. "This is my mother," he said, his voice steady and filled with a quiet power. "I want an explanation for why you're harassing her on her own property." The lead officer, suddenly unsure of himself, took a step back, his confidence faltering. Clara watched as Daniel confronted the officers, her fear slowly melting away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of pride. Her son was here, and he would make sure that justice was served. Clara Johnson sat firm, her back straight, her eyes locked on the officers who stood before her. She was not about to be intimidated. The lead officer, Officer Briggs, loomed closer, his expression hardening as he repeated his demand. "Ma'am, I need you to produce identification and prove that you belong in this neighborhood." His voice was filled with a sense of authority that brooked no challenge, but Clara's resolve only strengthened. The sun beat down on Clara's porch, highlighting every crease in her weathered but dignified face. The neighborhood had grown quiet. The usual sounds of children playing and cars humming down the street replaced by an uneasy silence. Clara could feel eyes watching her from behind curtains, but no one dared to step out. Her stomach churned with a mix of fear and frustration, but she kept her voice calm. "Officer, I've told you already, I am in my own home. I don't need to prove anything to anyone to sit on my own porch." A flicker of annoyance crossed Officer Briggs' face, and he leaned in closer, trying to use his size to intimidate. Clara met his eyes, her own gaze unwavering, though her heart pounded heavily in her chest. She could feel her pulse in her ears, each beat echoing her determination. "I've lived here for over 50 years, she continued, her voice steady. "I do not carry identification to enjoy the shade of my own front porch." Behind Officer Briggs, the second officer, Officer Turner, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted between Clara and his partner, and there was a hesitation in his stance. He seemed less convinced of the necessity of their actions, but he said nothing, his hand still resting tensely near his belt. Clara could see the unease on his face, and a part of her hoped that he might step in, that he might stop this from escalating further. But Briggs was undeterred. "You're obstructing our investigation, ma'am," Briggs said, his voice growing sharper, frustration evident in the way his eyes narrowed. "If you won't cooperate, we'll have to take you to the station for further questioning." Clara felt the insult sting deep. To be accused of not belonging in her own home, to be treated as if she was a criminal. It brought back memories she had tried to bury, memories of times when she had been made to feel less than, times when she had been told she didn't belong. But Clara was not the same young woman who had been forced to keep her head down in the face of injustice. She had learned to stand tall, and she would do so now. With a deep breath, she spoke, her voice clear and without a tremble. "Officer Briggs, I have not done anything wrong. I have nothing to admit, and I am certainly not going anywhere with you. This is my property, and I have every right to be here." The air seemed to thicken with tension. Briggs' face twisted in anger. He was not used to people defying him, especially not an elderly woman sitting on a porch in a neighborhood he clearly did not think she belonged in. His jaw tightened, and his hand moved toward the cuffs at his side. "All right then, you're under arrest for obstruction," he started, but before he could finish his sentence, another voice interrupted. "Enough!" The voice was strong, commanding, and cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife. Clara turned her head, her heart swelling with both relief and pride as she saw her son, Daniel, approaching. He moved with the kind of authority that came naturally to him. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed sharply in a suit, his expression a mix of controlled anger and determination. Daniel's eyes locked onto Officer Briggs, and in that moment, everything shifted. The power dynamic flipped, and the officer seemed suddenly less certain. Daniel was not just any man. He was a respected judge, a man who understood the law better than either of these officers could imagine. He was also a man fiercely protective of his mother. "That's my mother," Daniel said, his voice calm but filled with unmistakable authority. "And I'd like to know exactly why you think you have the right to harass her on her own property." He stepped onto the porch, positioning himself beside Clara, his eyes never leaving Briggs. Briggs faltered, the confidence in his stance beginning to waver. He looked at Daniel, clearly taken aback. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity. We're just following up," he said, though his voice lacked the bluster it had carried moments before. Daniel raised an eyebrow, his expression one of disbelief. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. "This is her home. She's been sitting here on her own porch." "Who reported this so-called suspicious activity?" His gaze moved past Briggs, catching sight of Mrs. Summers peeking out from her window. Mrs. Summers, realizing she had been noticed, quickly ducked back behind her curtains. Officer Turner cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. "It was a neighbor, sir. They reported someone matching the description. We're just trying to ensure the safety of the neighborhood." He glanced at Officer Briggs, almost as if seeking approval. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "And how exactly does an elderly woman sitting on her porch threaten the safety of the neighborhood?" He gestured towards Clara, who was still seated, her hands resting calmly on her lap, though her eyes betrayed the stress of the situation. "This is a disgrace," Daniel continued. "Instead of protecting the community, you're harassing its members." Briggs bristled, his pride wounded. "We're just doing our job, sir," he snapped, but there was less force behind his words now. Daniel took a step forward, his expression hardening. "Your job is to serve and protect, officer. I see neither service nor protection happening here today." He reached into his suit jacket, pulling out his ID badge. "I'm Judge Daniel Johnson. I want both your badge numbers, and I expect a full report filed about this incident." Turner's eyes widened as he looked at the badge, and even Briggs seemed to deflate slightly. The realization that they had overstepped their bounds was settling in. Daniel's presence had thrown them off balance, and the power they thought they held was slipping away. Clara watched her son, her heart swelling with pride. Here he was, standing up for her, just as she had taught him to stand up for what was right. She could see the officers exchange uneasy glances. They were no longer in control, and they knew it. "Listen, Judge Johnson," Briggs began, his tone now noticeably softer. "We're just trying to follow up on a call. We didn't mean to cause any harm." Daniel's eyes narrowed further, and he shook his head. "Harm has already been done, officer. You have humiliated and frightened an innocent woman, my mother, without cause. I will make sure that this is addressed appropriately." Briggs swallowed, nodding slightly, and glanced at Turner, who looked visibly relieved that things hadn't escalated further. We'll be on our way then," Briggs muttered, clearly eager to leave now that the tables had turned. Daniel stepped aside, watching them retreat to their cruisers, his arm protectively around Clara's shoulders. As the officers left, the tension in the air slowly dissipated. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Daniel knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. "You don't need to thank me, Mom. I'm just doing what's right." The neighbors who had been watching from the safety of their homes began to emerge, some looking sheepish, others appearing curious. Mrs. Summers peeked out again, her expression one of guilt. Clara noticed, but chose to ignore her for now. Instead, she focused on her son, the man she had raised to be courageous and kind. Daniel turned towards a gathered crowd, his voice ringing out clearly. "This is a community. We need to look out for each other, not call the police on our neighbors without cause. My mother deserves better, and so does everyone else here." The people shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement. Clara knew that today was not just about her. It was about standing up for the dignity of every person in the neighborhood. And with her son by her side, she knew they had taken an important step towards ensuring that dignity was upheld. Just when the situation seemed to be spiraling out of control, a new presence arrived, Daniel Johnson. Daniel had come for his usual Sunday visit, but as he pulled up to the house, he could see that something was wrong. The police cars parked in front, the tense body language of the officers, and most importantly, the sight of his mother sitting on the porch with officers closing in. It all painted a picture that filled him with concern and determination. Daniel stepped out of his car, his tall frame and formal attire immediately drawing the attention of the officers. There was a calm authority in the way he moved, the way he carried himself. As he approached, he didn't raise his voice, yet his presence demanded respect. Clara, feeling the tension seep out of her shoulders at the sight of her son, watched as Daniel strode forward, his expression a mix of determination and controlled anger. "What's going on here?" Daniel asked, his voice level but with an undertone that made it clear he would not tolerate nonsense. He positioned himself between his mother and the officers, his eyes focused on Officer Briggs, who still held the posture of a man trying to exert control. Clara could see the visible shift in the atmosphere. The officers suddenly looked less sure of themselves. Her son was here, and she knew that his presence alone could change the dynamic entirely. Officer Briggs turned to face Daniel, his demeanor shifting slightly as he took in the imposing figure in front of him. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. We're just following up," he explained, though his words lacked the conviction they'd had moments before. Daniel's gaze hardened. He glanced at his mother, still sitting calmly despite everything, and then back at the officers. "Suspicious activity," he repeated, a note of incredulity in his voice. "This is her house. She's sitting on her porch. What exactly is suspicious about that?" The younger officer, Officer Turner, looked visibly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and tried to elaborate. "We got a call from a resident. They said someone matching her description was acting suspiciously." He gestured vaguely, clearly aware of how weak his explanation sounded now that Daniel was questioning it. Daniel crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes never leaving the officers. "And that resident, did they bother to mention that this woman has lived here for decades? That she's a part of this community?" He shook his head, his tone firm. "My mother does not need to prove her right to be here to anyone." Briggs shifted his weight, clearly unsure of how to respond. The confidence he had displayed earlier was waning, faced with Daniel's authority. He attempted to recover, his voice lacking the bluster it once had. "Sir, we're just doing our job. We need to make sure everything is safe." Daniel took a step forward, his voice lowering, but gaining an edge that commanded attention. "Your job," he said, "is to protect the people of this community, not intimidate them. My mother is not a threat. She's a 78-year-old woman sitting on her own porch, and this harassment stops now." He pulled out his ID, showing his credentials as a judge. "I'm Judge Daniel Johnson, and I expect both of your badge numbers. I will be filing a formal complaint." Officer Turner's eyes widened at the sight of Daniel's ID, and even Briggs seemed to take a step back. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. This was no longer an elderly woman they could intimidate. They were now dealing with someone who knew the law inside and out and had the authority to hold them accountable. Clara watched as the officers exchanged a glance, both of them clearly at a loss. Her heart swelled with pride. Daniel had always been strong, always known when to stand up and when to fight. Today, he was using his strength to protect her, just as she had protected him when he was a child. The officers finally nodded, reluctantly stepping back. Briggs muttered something about just doing their job, but there was no force behind his words anymore. "We'll be leaving now, ma'am," Turner said, his tone subdued. He glanced at Clara, a hint of regret in his eyes. Briggs followed suit, their earlier bravado gone. They made their way back to their cruiser, and within moments, the tension in the air began to dissolve as the sound of the police car engines faded into the distance. Daniel turned to his mother, kneeling beside her and taking her hand gently. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his eyes softening as he looked at her. Clara nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm fine now, Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Daniel shook his head, his voice gentle. "You don't have to thank me. You raised me to know what's right. I'm just doing what you taught me." He helped her to her feet, wrapping an arm around her shoulders protectively. As the neighbors slowly began to emerge, some looking curious, others ashamed, Daniel raised his voice, addressing them. "This is a community. We look out for each other. Let's not forget that." Clara leaned into her son, feeling the strength in his words and knowing that today was not just a victory for her, but a reminder for everyone of what community truly meant. Realizing who Daniel was, a judge, the officers suddenly became visibly uncomfortable. The commanding presence of Judge Daniel Johnson left them unsure of how to proceed. They had entered the situation thinking they could intimidate a defenseless elderly woman, but now they faced a respected figure of authority, and it was clear they had overstepped their bounds. The power dynamic shifted quickly and decisively, and Daniel seized the opportunity to demand answers. "Why are you harassing a long-time resident without any justifiable cause?" Daniel's voice, though steady, carried a firmness that made the officers falter. Clara, seated on her porch, watched the transformation in the officer's demeanor with a mix of relief and pride. Daniel's insistence on justice was something she had always instilled in him, and seeing it now in action made her heart swell. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Neighbors who had been peeking from behind their curtains started stepping out of their houses, curiosity and concern evident in their expressions. Among them was Mrs. Summers, her face flushed with embarrassment as she realized she had sparked this entire incident. She stood at a distance, her eyes meeting Daniel's for a fleeting moment before she looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Daniel took note of the growing crowd, but his focus remained on the officers. "Who called in this report?" he demanded, his eyes shifting momentarily towards Mrs. Summers, who visibly stiffened. The officers hesitated, exchanging an uncertain glance. Briggs, who had earlier been commanding and forceful, now seemed far less assured. "It was a concerned resident," he began, but Daniel cut him off, his tone sharper. "A concerned resident?" Daniel repeated, his gaze sweeping over the assembled neighbors, finally landing on Mrs. Summers. He addressed her directly, his voice calm but unyielding. "Mrs. Summers, was it you who called the police on my mother?" Mrs. Summers swallowed hard, her cheeks reddening further as all eyes turned towards her. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Clara and Daniel. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "I saw someone I didn't recognize, and I thought—" "You thought?" Daniel interjected, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've lived next door to my mother for years. How could you not recognize her?" The tension in his voice was palpable, and Mrs. Summers seemed to shrink under the weight of his words. Clara, watching this exchange, felt a mix of emotions: anger at the unjustified suspicion, sadness for the mistrust that had brewed within her own community, but also a sense of hope that perhaps this incident could serve as a turning point. Officer Turner, who had been silent, finally spoke up, his tone conciliatory. "Look, Judge Johnson, we didn't mean any harm. We were just responding to a call, trying to do our jobs." He glanced at his partner, who nodded reluctantly, both of them now looking for a way out of the confrontation that had spiraled beyond their control. Daniel sighed, his expression softening slightly, though the edge in his voice remained. "Your job is to protect this community, not intimidate its members. You have a duty to understand who you're dealing with before you escalate a situation like this. My mother has lived here for over 50 years. She deserves your respect, not suspicion." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth and the authority he carried. As Daniel spoke, Clara felt a warmth spread through her, a mix of gratitude and pride. This was her son, standing up not just for her, but for what was right. She looked around at the neighbors gathered, their faces a mix of shame, concern, and reflection. Mrs. Summers lowered her gaze, a tear slipping down her cheek. It was clear that the impact of Daniel's words was not lost on anyone present. Daniel turned back to the officers, his tone softening just a fraction. I want you to think about this the next time you receive a call like this one. Understand who you're here to protect and who you're truly serving." Officer Briggs nodded, the arrogance from earlier completely gone, replaced by a subdued and chastened demeanor. Turner added, "We understand, Judge. We're sorry for the misunderstanding." With that, the officers began to retreat, their steps slower, less assured than when they had arrived. The crowd remained silent, watching as they left, the tension slowly dissolving into the afternoon air. Daniel turned to the neighbors, his gaze lingering on each of them before he spoke. "We need to do better as a community. We need to know each other, to trust each other. Suspicion and fear cannot be the foundation on which we live." His voice carried across the quiet street, resonating with the truth that everyone needed to hear. Clara watched as her son's words hung in the air, hoping they would leave an impression that would last beyond this day. Mrs. Summers stepped forward hesitantly, her eyes brimming with regret. "I'm truly sorry, Clara," she said, her voice trembling. Clara gave a small, gracious nod. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Summers. What matters is that we learn from them." As the crowd began to disperse, Daniel turned back to Clara, his expression softening completely now. "Let's go inside, Mom," he said gently, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Clara nodded, leaning into her son's warmth, grateful that despite the ugliness of what had happened, there was still hope. Hope that things could change, that people could change, and that perhaps today was the beginning of something better for everyone. Following the incident on Clara's porch, Daniel knew that simply letting things slide wasn't an option. He had witnessed firsthand how easily prejudice could slip into everyday life, even in his mother's own front yard. He filed an official complaint with the police department, outlining the officer's actions and highlighting the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to occur. Daniel's position as a judge lent weight to the complaint, and soon enough, word spread beyond the confines of the neighborhood. It didn't take long for Clara's story to gain traction in the local media. A respected judge defending his elderly mother against apparent racial profiling was a story that captured attention, and soon, local news outlets were knocking on Clara's door, eager to hear her side. Clara was initially reluctant. She had never sought the spotlight, preferring the quiet life she'd built over decades. But after talking it over with Daniel, she realized that her story could spark important conversations. She agreed to speak, hoping that sharing her experience could prevent others from enduring the same humiliation. The coverage ignited a spark that couldn't be easily put out. Footage of Daniel standing up to the officers, along with interviews with Clara, became a symbol of the struggle against everyday injustices faced by people of color. Discussions about racial profiling and police bias began cropping up at city council meetings, in local cafes, and on social media. Clara's porch, once just a place for her to enjoy a quiet afternoon, had become the backdrop for something far bigger than herself. Community leaders took note, and soon, the neighborhood was abuzz with activity. Residents, both old and new, began organizing town hall meetings to discuss the issues that had been festering beneath the surface for years. Clara attended each one, often sitting at the front, her presence a reminder of why these conversations were necessary. People who had never spoken before now stood up, sharing their experiences of feeling like outsiders in their own community. There were stories of microaggressions, of looks that lingered too long, of calls to authorities made without cause. Each story added depth to what had happened to Clara, revealing a pattern that could no longer be ignored. At the first town hall meeting, Daniel spoke, his voice echoing through the packed room. "We must face the reality that biases, whether intentional or not, are present in our community. We cannot hope to grow if we ignore them." His words were met with a mixture of nodding heads and uneasy glances. Clara watched as her son spoke with conviction, feeling a swell of pride. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting for everyone who had ever felt marginalized. One of the most surprising moments came when Mrs. Summers, the neighbor who had called the police, stood up to speak. She was visibly nervous, her voice trembling as she began. "I want to apologize," she said, looking directly at Clara. "I was wrong. I let my fear and assumptions get the better of me, and I see now the harm that caused." The room was silent, all eyes on Mrs. Summers as she continued. "I want to do better, and I want to be part of making this neighborhood a place where everyone feels they belong." Clara nodded, her expression softening. She could see the sincerity in Mrs. Summers' eyes, and though the hurt couldn't be erased, she knew that forgiveness was a step towards healing. "Thank you, Mrs. Summers," Clara replied, her voice clear. "We all need to learn from this. It's not just about one mistake. It's about how we move forward from here." The meetings continued over the following weeks, and slowly, change began to take root. Clara's story had highlighted the need for accountability, and the local police department was compelled to respond. They announced new training initiatives focused on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity, aimed at preventing incidents like the one involving Clara from happening again. Officers were encouraged to engage with the community, not just as enforcers of the law, but as neighbors. Clara watched the announcements on the news, feeling a cautious sense of optimism. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The neighborhood also began to change. What had once been an environment of suspicion started shifting towards one of understanding and empathy. Neighbors who had barely exchanged a word before now greeted each other more warmly. Clara's porch, once the site of such tension, became a gathering spot. She started hosting small get-togethers, inviting those who had shown support during the incident and those who wanted to learn. Mrs. Summers often attended, bringing along a dish to share, and she and Clara began to forge a new, albeit fragile, friendship. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of awkwardness, but they were both committed to trying. Daniel, too, continued his work. He became a vocal advocate for change, not just in his professional capacity, but also within the community. He met with the police chief, pushing for more transparent policies and community involvement in decision-making processes. His persistence paid off, and soon, a community advisory board was established to provide oversight and a voice for residents in matters of policing. Clara was invited to be part of the board, a role she accepted with both trepidation and pride. She knew the importance of having someone who truly understood the stakes involved. The changes weren't without resistance. There were those who believed the situation had been blown out of proportion, who felt that the officers had just been doing their job. But Clara and Daniel knew that meaningful change was rarely met without pushback. They remained steadfast, understanding that the journey towards true equality was long and fraught with challenges, but also filled with moments of hope. One day, as Clara sat on her porch, this time surrounded by neighbors' laughter and the clinking of glasses, she realized how much had shifted. What had once been a moment of fear and humiliation had become a catalyst for transformation. Clara looked around at the people gathered, seeing faces of different backgrounds, all united by a desire to make their community better. She caught Daniel's eye, and he smiled at her, the unspoken understanding passing between them. They had turned something painful into something powerful. As the sun began to set, Clara stood, raising her glass. "To our community," she said, her voice strong. "May we continue to learn, to grow, and to support one another." The group raised their glasses in response, the warmth of their voices filling the evening air. Clara knew there was still much work to be done, but for now, this was enough. A step in the right direction, a glimpse of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear. The journey from that fateful afternoon on the porch to this moment had been difficult, but it had also been deeply rewarding. Clara had always believed in the strength of her community, and now, more than ever, she knew that belief was not misplaced. Together, they were moving forward one step at a time. Months later, significant changes were underway in both the community and the police department. Clara watched as her neighborhood began to transform, a sense of unity slowly replacing the old mistrust and suspicion. The police department, under public scrutiny, implemented new policies aimed at reducing bias and improving community relations. Officers were now required to attend cultural sensitivity training, and a community advisory board was established to provide oversight. Clara often sat on her porch, reflecting on how that painful experience had sparked something much larger. What had begun as a humiliating confrontation had evolved into a movement for change, one that she never imagined she would be a part of. She was proud of her son Daniel for his leadership and of her neighbors who had stepped up to support each other. Clara knew there was still much work to be done. Real change took time, and it took the continued effort of everyone involved. But with each town hall meeting, each neighborly conversation, and each small gesture of goodwill, Clara saw hope. She hoped that with perseverance and ongoing dialogue, their community would grow stronger and true, lasting change would take root. This story shows the power of resilience and standing up for what's right. Clara's courage and Daniel's unwavering commitment to justice remind us of the importance of community and the need to confront biases. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to Life Story 999 for more inspiring content.